Matthew Hassan, thank you for joining Business Weekend. Let's start with the confidence index that we saw this week from Westpac. Now, it fell 6%, basically reversing the previous month's gains. Now, the survey, I understand, was taken largely before the worst of the Victorian lockdown. So does this mean that we're pretty much guaranteed a further fall in August?
Well, we'll see what comes out of August. I think over the course of the survey week, it's quite interesting that the lockdown was instated sort of around about the middle of the week, and closure of borders as well around about the same time. We did see a little bit of firming, so I think in some respects, people get a little bit more confident once they see that the government's acting to contain the outbreak. I think more so though, the weakness, if we do see it next month, will be around what happens outside of Victoria. So after the survey had closed, we had this cluster of cases in southwest Sydney, and that news started to sort of flow through this week. If that builds from there, then I would see a wider weakness. For the month alone, Victorian sentiment was down 10%. So it was 6% nationally, 10% in Victoria, only down about 4.5% elsewhere. So I think if we start to see that spilling out into other states, that's where we might see the weakness next month.
Of course, we know Treasury officials right now are frantically putting together their forecasts for next week's update. What sort of relationship does the confidence index have with things like growth and employment?
So it's a little bit unusual at the moment because I think the overarching factor that's affecting growth is the virus lockdown measures themselves. So, sentiment obviously captures some of that, but it doesn't link directly. The scale of the contraction that we're going to see through the second quarter, we think it's about a 7% contraction. While we've seen sentiment weak, it doesn't capture anything like that because that's an unprecedented contraction in activity. So I think when it comes to sort of linking back to sentiment, we need to be a little bit careful about how we tie that. And I think what's got us a little bit more concerned about this particular weakening in sentiment is that there looks to have been a loss of confidence around the medium to longer term outlook for the economy. So if you go back to the big fall in April when we had the nationwide lockdown, we had about an 18% drop in sentiment that month, extreme fall. And the rebound that happened after that was a byproduct of the success of containing the virus, and policy, government policy looked to be really effective. I think what's happened with this latest fall, we've seen, and within the detail of the sentiment, we had about a 5% fall in the 5-year outlook for the economy. So it held up pretty well, and it rebounded to above pre-COVID levels. I think there was a confidence there that the response was going to be able to contain the virus and that our economy would be back and running. This time around, the 6% drop in sentiment, the headline sentiment, also saw a 10% drop in that 5-year outlook piece. And I think it's really cast doubt on our ability to contain the virus and go back to operating as business as usual. As we've seen, domestic travel now looks on a much slower recovery, reopening path. And I think that's really what has us a bit more concerned this time around.
Just moving on to property prices now, I've certainly been struck, given that we're 4 or 5 months into crisis territory now, by basically how little prices have fallen. I mean, in June we saw, I think, even in Melbourne, prices fell by, I think, about 1% over the month, which is nowhere near what was being forecast back in March. So how do you explain the resilience of the property market?
I think a lot of it is about a slow motion shock. All the policy measures that we've seen in response to the coronavirus have been about cushioning the household sector. So we've had large JobKeeper and job seeker payment increases. We've had this temporary home loan deferment package, which has had a major take of about 9% of all borrowers are now on temporary home loan repayments holidays. And we've also had these measures that have been designed to delay and cushion the shock through the rental market. And so I think that's at the core of why we've seen such a mild impact on prices. I think we're starting to see the sort of drip of price declines. And while it's down 1% in the month, in Melbourne prices are down 3% now from their peak.
Since the start of the year?
Yeah, over the quarter. So it has started to move through. I think, though, it'll be much more of a delayed response. And I think that the key to this is that for property markets, they're not really at the epicentre of this shock. The epicentre of this shock is anything that relates to the coronavirus, so it's travel and tourism and services and anything that involves crowds, basically. The housing market in particular is collateral damage in this situation. It's once that shock affects the household sector and then the household's ability to pay into the market, into a weak market. I think there's another key here that, we're all talking about the fiscal cliff that's looming at the end of September. And the fourth quarter really does shape as a real test for the housing market. If we go over that fiscal cliff, if the wind down of these home loan repayment holidays coincides with that, then that's going to be when the housing market more fully reflects the shock that the economy's seen.
Okay, Matthew Hassan, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.